Thank you. All right, thank you all. So I have this list of questions here. I'm going to try to get to everything. I think I should be able to get to everything, and you might have questions on your own, so I'll try to leave some time at the end as well. But we'll do our best to get through as much as we can. So one of the things I liked about the questions is that there are many of them that go back to something that I say in every one of the classes. So if you guys have attended the classes before, you've heard me say that selection is the most important thing always, all the time. And it rings true with everything you do, and it's true now. So one of the questions actually was how to make quick precision selections and use Refine Edge, which is great because I'll start with that because I usually like to start with selection anyway. And we're going to even come back to the concept of selection again as we go along because we always come back to it, and it will be the answer to some of the other questions. Well, you'll see. All right, anyway. So, it could work any photo, obviously. The one thing that's hard about selections always is that every photo is different. Every photo has different challenges. One of the questions also happened to have been using paths, which is a much more advanced topic, but I think I'll try to get to that at least a little bit later on. So paths is another alternative for selections, but if you've been to the beginner classes, you've probably heard me talk about things like the regular selection tools. You know about the marquees. I don't think anyone needs to learn how to make a rectangular or elliptical selection, but lasso, a lot of people, of course, have used those or whatever. But as I always like to start off, and someone asked about quick selections, the best way to make a quick selection is the quick selection tool, which is why it's called the quick selection tool, because it can select things based on their color or shade. So I picked a photo where there was an easy selection to be had and also difficult ones. The easy one in this case being the sky, and the reason the sky is so easy is because it is bordered by dark mountains. So when there's a real disparity in color or shade on your photograph, you should take advantage of that at all times. So I took the quick selection tool, which by the way is right here, and there's different tools in the same slot. There's also the magic wand. The magic wand is similar, but it only selects a specific color. Notice how it captured a lot of the blue area, but didn't capture anything else when I just clicked with the magic wand. But the quick selection tool is like the magic wand, except for the fact that you take it and you click and drag with it, and when you drag, it selects as many colors as you drag across. And the first little tip that I have, and I'm going to go through little tips as we go along, as I always do. One I've mentioned just about every class I think I've ever taught here is the fact that whenever you have a tool that has a brush associated with it, and the quick selection tool is actually a brush, even though it doesn't paint, you should use the open and close bracket keys to the right of letter P to make your brush bigger and smaller so that you can make your brush a good size. Because it would be bad if it was so small that you're just getting this much, and it would be bad, of course, also if it was this big, you wouldn't be able to isolate it within the area of the sky. So I make the brush a reasonable size. I click and I start to drag, and I make sure to just touch all of the different pixels I want to select. But you'll notice I never came close to the mountains, because if I would have come close to the mountains and touched the mountains, Photoshop would have thought I want to include the mountains in the selection as well, and therefore it would have gone further than I wanted it to go. Now there was a section, and I did this on purpose, that I missed when I was dragging across. Notice it was smart enough to figure out that I wanted all the mountains and the clouds and stuff like that, but you may notice that there's this little blue section up here that is not included in the selection. The quick selection tool is also the fastest to use because it is automatically set to add. So what I mean by that is, if you miss a spot, you just go over and drag across that spot and notice how it adds it into that selection automatically. The one thing that it's not set automatically to do is take away. So if, God forbid, I had dipped into one of the mountains down here, for example, and notice now how the selection is dipping down below the sky, but I still have that really good color disparity. So I'm going to stay with the same tool, the quick selection tool. I'm going to make it a little smaller. And usually to add to a selection, you use the Shift key, except with the quick selection tool, you don't have to. But with any tool that selects, to take away from a selection, you hold the Option key, or that would be Alt on your PCs. And I'm going to stay just within the mountain area, and notice how it is removing these colors from my selection and getting the selection back to normal. And if I went a little too far, I'll just go back to adding a little bit. And the fact is, now I'm having a little bit of trouble getting that edge correct. And that's showing you that it's just better not to go over the edge in the first place and make it good in the first place. In fact, I don't like it, so I'm going to deselect and start all over again, because look at how much better it is when you do it the right way the first time. OK, so That's my advice for making the quickest selection. Then the other part of that question was refining the edge. Always make sure to refine the edge when you make a selection. It's always a good thing to do. On the top panel of your screen is the options bar. The options bar always has options related to the tool that you're currently using. So any of the selection tools will have a button that says Refine Edge. You'll notice it says it right up there. If it's not up there, you can always go into the Select menu and choose the Refine Edge command. That would always work as well. So when I click Refine Edge, you'll see that it tells me or shows me exactly what my selection looks like and lets me see how good the edges of my selection are, like if they're clean enough for me or whatever. It depends on the selection. Sometimes it's going to be very clean, and sometimes Quick Selection or a Magic Wand, which are the two tools that select by color or shade, are going to have little halos. Like you can see, I have a little bit of a weirdness around the outer edge there. So Select or Refine Edge is always going to fix that sort of thing. Smooth is one tool that you could use to smooth out your edges. It would be nice if you have a real pixelated edge, but if you have a varied edge like by shape, Smooth might smooth things out too much. So I don't want to lose like all the little dips and nips and tucks of the mountain, so I don't want to smooth too much. Feather will soften. I'm sure many of you have used Feather before. Notice how it's softening the selection so much that I'm now including some of the mountains as well. But a solution to smoothing, if smoothing is not good because it smooths out too much, something I've mentioned before is a little bit of Feather, not too much because you don't want to soften too much. And when I say a little bit, a pixel is a little bit. If it's a higher res image, maybe 5 pixels might even still be a little bit. But then you increase the contrast more than you did Feather, because that will recapture the crispness of the selection. But a combination of Feather, a little bit of Feather, and more contrast will always give you a nicely smoothed edge. In other words, you won't have those really jagged edges on the edges of your selection, but it won't be too soft either because the contrast counteracts the feathering option. And then finally is Shift Edge, where Shift Edge to the right will, as you can see, make the selection bigger. Notice how I've included that little ridge of mountains on the edge there. And Shifting Edge to the left will, of course, make the selection a little bit smaller. So if your selection had that little bit of a line on the edge there, you might have noticed before I shifted the edge, remember I was a little bit of a line there, a little bit of sort of pixels I didn't want. I shift the edge to the left a little bit, and I get rid of that really easily. So refining edge is something you should always take care of and always attend to when you're selecting things. There are other sections of Refine Edge, just to go quickly. There's looking at things on different colors, like if you want to see it on black instead of on white or something else. Usually on white is best for most purposes. And there's a couple other sections called Edge Detection and Output, which, if we have time, we'll get to a little bit later, which have to do with selecting hair and fur and all those kinds of things. So we're just going to click OK. Our selection doesn't look all that different, but at this point, of course, now that we made a selection, we'd be able to do anything, and I figure I might as well just go ahead and do some kind of command where I'll make it look like it's sort of like a darker sky. Now, I just do want to talk, though, about, and I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about masks, because what the heck, people were asking about masks a little bit. So you'll notice that when I made the sky darker, I'm going to make it really obviously darker. I missed that little one there. There we go. You notice how the ridge around the mountains, I might have taken that ridge away too much. So you could see that my selection was a little small. It was not quite what I wanted it to be. So something that you can do whenever you make an adjustment based on a selection. And when I'm saying an adjustment based on a selection, remember, sometimes you do adjustments without a selection, because you might want to do an adjustment to the whole photo. But if you're doing an adjustment to one section of the photo, as I did here, and if you have, let's say, an edge that you don't like, let's say you didn't refine edge, or you just refined edge badly, or something like that, you have a mask, so you still have the opportunity to fix things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click the mask. The mask is that little black and white icon that's associated with the adjustment. And you'll see that my properties has changed from being an adjustment to being controls that are related to a mask. And you'll notice that there are some controls that I have here, like, for example, feather. I can feather after the fact. Notice how I'm getting a really soft edge, sort of making it look like it's glowing around the outer edge of the mountains. I could do that. Or I can do this. I can go into the button that says Mask Edge, which, as you can see, is exactly the same thing as Refine Edge, but it's Refine Edge after the fact. So it's after you've already done your command, after you see that your selection wasn't perfect. So you go to Refine Mask. Now, how am I going to tell if the Mask Edge is good in this view, right? I can't really tell. I was able to see before when I could see the whole photo. So as I was just talking about, the view mode is really important. In this case, I want to see the view mode, I think it's on layers, which makes me see the whole photo as it was. And now that I can see the photo as it was, watch what happens when I shift the edge one way or the other. Notice I can fix that little, and if by the way, shift edge works a little bit more when you feather a little bit. So notice now I can shift the edge one way or the other to sort of fix the edge to be what I wanted it to be, maybe soften it a little bit more and get, that that edge to be a little better than it was. The point is, though, you always have endless control over that, even if you forgot to refine edge at the beginning, or even if refining edge was not perfect in the beginning. So there we are. OK, so that's a little bit about selection and refining the edge, which moves us on to the next question. The next question, I put these in order of where I thought they would sort of work, whatever. But OK, so the next question I'm going to talk about was sent in. Do you guys want to know who sent them in? Like, I guess you'd know whose question is who. OK, I put the names here even also. But OK, the next question is when to use blending modes and why. And I was very happy with this question because I was just happy that somebody knew that there were blending modes, because that makes me very happy. Because a lot of times I think people ignore blending modes, and I think they're very important. So we're going to, I know, it's really sad. So I'm going to go ahead and open up something. Let's see. I don't know. I don't know why, but I feel like opening. This is a picture of my hand. What the heck? There it is. So I'm going to select this. And this is another one of these easy selections because it's all pretty much one color on a dark color background. But notice I want to make sure to get every finger included in the selection. There we go. All right. I'm not going to bother refining the edge. I think it's probably going to be a decent selection to begin with. And I'm going to move this into the other photograph. So when you want to move something into another photograph, you probably know there are two ways to do it. You can just copy, paste. You can just copy here, go to the other photo and paste. Or you could take the move tool, which is the tool that in fact moves pixels, and you can grab hold of it and drag it into, I'm just going to drag it into that other photograph that we were just working on and drop it in there. And oh my gosh, it's big. OK, so first of all, does everyone know why, right, a hand attacking Silverton, Colorado. Does anyone know why this has become so large? It's because of the resolution differential, right? When you have a high resolution photograph, that hand photo is high res, the Silverton photo is low res, things that get brought in become enormous. And if you have the opposite happening, it's because you brought something from low res photo into a high res photo. So obviously you have to fix this by transforming it. So I'm going to do my quickest thing for transform, which is Command T, which by the way, just show you in the menus, is the same thing as doing free transform. That's the fastest way to do this. So I do Command T. But if you've ever had this problem, this is something I've also shown in some of my classes, always a good thing to look at. There are resize boxes. Many of you have probably transformed before. There's resize boxes on the edges of a transformation. But this thing is so big, I can't see the resize boxes. So what I've seen students do is move to the side. They keep moving until they can find the resize box. But there's much better ways to do this. Probably the fastest way to do this, well, there's two ways that I think are really fast. One is I go up here to the options bar. I click the little chain link symbol right up there. When I activate that, it means that I'm going to resize in proportion. It's going to force it to stay in proportion, so I won't be distorting the hand at all. And then I go to the W or the H. I point to it with that little scrubby finger. I drag to the left. And notice I've just made the hand a normal size. That's a very quick and easy way to do it. So you don't have to grab the resize boxes. You could do it just by using the options bar up there. The other alternative, I brought it back to the way it was, is to just press Command 0 on your keyboard. Command 0 automatically resizes your screen to fit everything. And as you can see, you can now see the resize boxes. So you could do it the old-fashioned way by clicking and dragging. And by the way, if you were resizing and wanted to stay in proportion, I'm hoping everyone knows that you would hold the Shift key down normally. But in this case, I don't have to hold the Shift key down because I've already activated the little chain link symbol, which means it's going to stay in proportion no matter what. So I don't have to hold Shift because it's going to force it to stay in proportion. So let's put that hand in a reasonable place, I think, right there in the corner. Because the wrist was getting cut off, that seems to be the right place to put it. And of course, to confirm a transformation, you just hit return or double click, or there's 17 things you can do. Or you could click the little check mark up here, whatever. All right, so here I have the hand visible on top of the rest of my photograph. And of course, because it's a layer, it is, of course, being, put in on its own, and I can move it endlessly and not have to worry about anything like that. And I hope most of you know about layers, of course. So one thing I want to point out, though, too, notice that this layer is above all the other layers. Watch what happens if I move this layer below the adjustment that I made earlier. You'll notice a couple of the fingertips turn dark. That's really nasty looking. You have to be careful of that because remember that adjustment layers always adjust all the layers beneath them. So if you want something to not be affected by the adjustment layer, you want it to stay above the adjustment layer and therefore not be touched by it. OK, so the question, though, that we were answering is blending modes. Everyone knows about opacity. You have an opacity slider right here. You click and drag the opacity slider to your left, and you'll notice that it will, of course, make the hands partially see-through. But the reason I was excited by a blending mode question is because too many people leave out blending modes as a form of sort of blending the pixels of the current layer with the layers underneath it, as opposed to opacity. Opacity is only one alternative, and the blend modes give you 1,000 other alternatives available. There's about 20 or so. They keep adding a few every time they update Photoshop. There's a lot of different blending modes. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. Just to give you an idea, though, they're grouped in sort of logical categories. All the ones that start with darken are to use the pixels of the current layer to darken all the pixels of the layers beneath them. The next grouping, where it starts with lighten, they lighten all the layers beneath them. Then after that, there's one that starts with overlay. Those are all like overlays. It's sort of like the layer was made of light instead of made of solid pixels, and it blends everything together. You're going to see all these in a moment. And then there's difference mode, which is a negative, and all the ones below it sort of similar. And then some really subtle ones, my favorite being luminosity. It's really obvious what it does. Notice the colors of the layer beneath come through the hand in order for me to see. So, but I still have the light and dark values of the hand, of course, so they can make out the fact that it was a hand. Now, as you could imagine, if you were going to play with blending modes as opposed to opacities, or even both, it's going to be a really slow process if you're going to go one by one through every one of the 20-something blending modes and every one of the different opacity levels. So I'm going to give you a couple of shortcuts to be able to do both of those things. If you have a tool that does not have a blending mode or an opacity as one of its options, and I'm going to come back to that also, this concept of tools with blending modes. For example, the brush tool, which just paints. It has its own blending mode. Notice the same list of modes. And it has an opacity slider. So if you use the shortcuts now that I'm about to talk about, it would only change the way this tool is going to work. It would not change anything about the current layer with the hand on it. So what I have to do is choose a tool that doesn't have a blending mode or an opacity option, such as the Move tool. And now the shortcuts will work for the layer. So that's something to right off the bat be aware of. Then we'll talk a little bit later about using the blending modes when you're painting, like with a tool. But at this point, if I want to try the different blending modes, the keyboard shortcut for it is holding the Shift key and pressing the plus and minus keys on your keyboard. Plus will go forward, minus will go backward. So I am now pressing Shift plus, and notice it's taking me through one by one each and every blending mode to let me see what it looks like. All of these, by the way, are at 100% opacity. So you can see none of the blending modes really are solid. They're all going to be showing part of the layer underneath or the colors underneath in some way. And I can just experiment with which ones I like. I go through one by one. And then when I find one that I like, I can go backward by just hitting the minus key. The other alternative, I'm going to go back to normal mode. If I wanted to play with opacity in addition to blending mode, the shortcut for opacity is just pressing a number on your keyboard. So right now, for example, my opacity is 100%. I'm going to press the number 5. I'm at 50% opacity. I'm going to press the number 2. I'm at 20% opacity. And press the number 0. And I go back to 100% opacity. So blending modes, the way you use them and the time to use them is very simply when you're trying to take the pixels of the current layer and blend them with the pixels of the layers underneath. Now, to see this used in a couple of different examples, I opened up a couple of photos where I've done this sort of thing. So here's a photograph that is not the real photograph. Let me show you the original. I'm going to hide all these other layers. So here's my original photograph in Central Park. There's a little reflection in the water there, whatever. So what I did was I replaced the sky, and we're going to come back to that later on because it's a mask sort of thing. As you can see, I replaced the sky with a more interesting looking sky. And then what I wanted to do after that, I did a few other things. I darkened the edges, I darkened the buildings. That's what that did, right? I forgot about that. And I did a little black fade at the bottom because I just thought it would look nice. But my last layer that I've hidden for saved for last, the last layer And I'm going to show it, but then I'm going to show it by itself. The last layer, and show it without its mask. The last layer is a picture from the same sky from that same day, but flipped upside down, right? Then I made a mask for it, and we're going to talk a little bit about masks later on. And the mask, by the way, let me show everything now. The mask, as you can see, fits perfectly to the area of the water where the buildings aren't and where the trees aren't. And what I thought would be more realistic, let's look at this without that layer, is I wanted to see the new sky that I put in there reflected in the water because it was the old sky in there. So I used that new sky, and as you can see, I used the blending mode called overlay as opposed to normal mode, because if I use normal, it would be that solid version of the new sky just flipped upside down. But by having used overlay mode, I decided that overlay was sort of my best alternative. Didn't even have to reduce the opacity. It just put an overlay of that sky over the existing water, so it's sort of blending the two together, which is really what a reflection is. It's sort of the sky reflected in the water, and you see sort of a little bit of both. So that's one example of, let's call it realism, although I don't know if it's really real. And here's one that's not real at all. Let's show the original image here. And I might as well tell you a little shortcut here, by the way. You know the eyeball next to layers means that you can show or hide them. If you hold the Option key and click an eyeball on one layer, it hides every other layer but that one layer. So it's a really nice option. So notice right now I hid all the layers except for the background. This is some cool door that I took a picture of on Green Street, I think it is, down in the Village or Soho or something. And I was just playing around and making some other things sort of superimposed on there. So let's see the rest of the image. You know, just put some text in there and some other stuff. But very prominently, one of the main things you can see there, and I think it's using a similar mode. Here's a picture of Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn. And as you can see, I'm also, again, using overlay mode for that. And I put a little bit of a New York City skyline here, and that's using hard light mode. Because notice if it was in normal mode, I would be seeing, actually, in hard light, it's very similar to normal mode. Oh, I played with lesser opacity. That's what it is. So it's noticed it's 70-something% opacity. So, but again, I'm using the blending modes just to do exactly what the word says, blend the layers together so I can see one through the other and have them combine with one another. So that is why you use blending modes and when and all that sort of thing. OK. Next question, bring two or more photos together in the same file on different layers. Now, this can be interpreted a lot of different ways. My assumption, though, is that you're talking about having two different photos and having them side by side so that you can maybe print them on one piece of paper. I don't know, but that's what I'm going to show because bringing in two photos to the same file, just leaving them the same size and then blending them together would be just dragging one to the other photo, and that would be that. As long as they're the same resolution, there would be no problem at all. But let's close some of these and open up some new photos to take a look at. I'll leave this around just in case we happen to need a hand floating in the middle of a city somewhere. All right, so let's go into, we've got to go back through the sample photos. All right, so actually, I'm going to just open up a couple of background images that are similar size. Let's open this thing and this thing. They're both vertical, so what the heck. All right, they're not quite the same size, but so if I wanted to bring one photo into the other, as I said, all I'd have to do is just drag the one photo and drop it into the other one. Now I have two different layers, and that's really the answer, the simpler answer to that question. But if I wanted to put these photos side by side, I think that's the more pressing question in this case. And why did it leave that little outline? That's very strange. I don't think that's really there. No, it isn't. OK. So if I wanted to put these photos side by side, I'm going to use something called canvas size. Image size, which is in the image menu, which many of you may have used at some time, lets you see what the resolution of your photo is, what the size of the photo is, print size, that kind of stuff. But right below that is something called canvas size. What canvas size allows you to do is add extra size to this image around the outside. It doesn't change the existing pixels of the photograph. It just lets you add more pixels or take away pixels. So in other words, if you go into canvas size and make the size smaller, you're really cropping. And you might as well use the crop tool because it's a much more visual way of cropping the photo out. But if you make the canvas size numbers bigger, you're going to be adding more space to your image. So if I wanted to put these two photos side by side so that I could print them both at the same time, for example, I'm going to go over to the width component. I'm going to double it. Why not? And I'm going to anchor all the way at the far left so this original photo stays at the far left, so that when I click OK, as you can see, I now have extra space around the outside. I'm going to undo that because one more thing I wanted to show you in there, besides anchoring it and besides increasing the size, notice that I do get to choose the color of the canvas extension. By default, it's the background color, and by default, the background color is white. So most of the time, having it be white is just fine, but realize that you can actually make it a different color right in here if you felt like it. I don't feel like it, so I'm just going to leave it as OK there. And then, of course, once I bring this new photo over into this photograph and drop it in there, I now have two photos side by side. And this could be used for that purpose. This could be used, or canvas size could be used just to put extra space around the outside to make a greeting card, put some text. It could be used for a lot of different purposes. So that's pretty much the answer, I think, to bringing two photos together in the same file on different layers. And there we have it. OK, so let's close that up and close this up as well. All right. The next question was the proper use of the history brush. Not one that comes up very often and not something I've talked about in any of the classes I've given here so far. So I will show it, but I'm not a big user of the history brush. But I'm going to add a few other things. And for this, we're going to need the history palette. Many of you may know about the history palette. The history palette, of course, gives you a look. Look at all the things we did. Gives you a look at every single thing you've done since you opened up the photograph. Unfortunately, I've always lamented this. Every blend change is a step. So as you can see, I've got lots of blending changes here because I changed the blending mode in this photo many times. But all the different steps that I've taken since I've opened this photograph up are here. Is it every single step? Not necessarily. So as long as we're talking about history stages with the history brush, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can control the number of states that the history palette remembers. And I'm going to talk about why you don't need it to remember every single thing you ever did. OK, but first, I'm going to go into Photoshop Preferences. And by the way, if you have a PC, that's in Edit Preferences as opposed to in the Photoshop menu. And I'm going to go into, I believe it's just Interface is the section. Oh, it's not Interface. It's Performance. That's it. OK, I always know which one it is once I get in there. All right, so you notice that my history states is set to 50. I think that's the default nowadays when you first buy Photoshop, that it's set to 50, meaning it remembers 50 stages or steps that you've taken. So if you take 52 steps, the first two are forgotten, and you can't go back to them anymore. And you're probably thinking, that's horrible. So you might want to increase this. And notice if you increase it, the maximum is 1,000. Do not go home and increase yours to 1,000. It's not a good idea. Because the higher you make the number of history states, if you have a very slow computer at home, like one that's a few years old, it's going to slow down Photoshop. By the time you've done a few hundred steps, you're going to try to do anything, and it's going to take like a little clock that's going to spin and whatever. So you want to set the history states according to what your computer can take. If you have a new fast computer, then sure, crank it up to 100, 200, whatever. But my personal opinion is that if you work really efficiently, which means you put everything on layers and you make sure that you're never destroying original layers and all that sort of thing, you shouldn't even need more than 50 history states because I think it's plenty enough. But you can go ahead and decide for yourself, and there you have how to change it. All right, but now we're going to see how to use the history states and the history brush, and also something which I think is even more useful, something called snapshots, to be sort of keeping track of everything that you do. All right, so we're going to go ahead and make a new layer. And this also will bring me back, it's all tying in. It's going to bring me back to, remember when we talked about blending modes? I was talking about layer blending modes, but there's also tool blending modes, and I'm going to talk about those as well. So I've made a brand new layer, and I'm going to get into renaming these layers, because one of the things I really stress with people is renaming your layers, because having 20 layers where they're all named 1 through 20 is really not very helpful. So, all right, I made this brand new layer. Let's blow up the picture a little bit. And I'm going to, I just did Command-0, that keyboard shortcut to make the picture full size. And I'm going to grab hold of the paintbrush tool. OK, and as we know, open and close brackets make the brush bigger and smaller. OK, now I made a brand new layer to paint, and this is something that's really important. I think you should always keep in mind. If you're going to paint randomly on your photograph, never should you paint randomly on a layer that already has pixels on it. Why don't you paint on a blank layer so that you have more flexibility in what you can do with it? And with that said, if you paint on a blank layer, I don't recommend painting with blending modes too much, because unless you want there to be different blending modes on the same layer, I'll show you what I mean. So right now I'm at normal mode, 100% opacity, which means when I paint with my foreground color, which is currently orange, I just click and drag, and notice I'm painting. I should maybe do something more useful. I'll draw a little smiley face, because that's what I like to do. OK, so here we have a little smiley face drawn across. And of course, that takes several steps, several strokes, right? I did a bunch of things. All right. Now, because I painted in normal mode at 100% opacity, it means that, of course, that orange that I painted is solid and is blocking all the other pixels. But what can I do now? I can take the blending mode of the layer as a whole and change the blending mode of the layer so it blends with the pixels underneath it. So that's why I don't recommend really using blending modes when you're painting that often, because you should paint with normal mode, 100% opacity, and then later on, if you decide you want your paint to be see-through, you can change the blending mode or opacity of the layer to make it partially see-through. And that's a much more efficient way of working. The only time I would ever change the blend mode of a painting tool is when I want to be able to, let's say, have the strokes that I make change color when they crisscross each other. I just went into difference mode, which, as you can see, just makes a negative when the colors cross over one another. It's really rare that you would do that. And personally, I would have actually just preferred another new layer and then blend those two layers together with one another. I think it would have been more efficient. All right, so here I've made a bunch of things that I didn't want to do, or I did a bunch of things that I want to do. Now, many of you probably know by now that to undo a lot of these things, I can just click on any one of these stages. Like I can go back before I did a lot of different things. Now I'm back at one of the blending modes that I was choosing for the hand. None of the painting is happening anymore. Or I can go forward to when I did actually paint all that stuff, or I can go back to before I painted those little lines, whatever. That's one way of going back and forth. And any of you who've attended my classes before also know another way to go back and forth is keyboard shortcut. Instead of just Command-Z, which is one undo, you do Command-Option-Z, which is multiple undos. It's the same thing as what is called step backward. It's like right here in the edit menu. But here's where the history brush comes in. The history brush lets you selectively undo, but not undo everything. So let's say I wanted to undo some of the lines that I had painted here with this little smiley face, but I don't want to get rid of them all. Let's say I want to get rid of part of them. So I'm going to go back to what is called the history brush. This is the history brush tool right here. And there's the art history brush, which I find completely useless, right underneath it. And we're going to take that history brush, make it a little bit bigger. Now, on the history palette, there is a history stage that is set. And by default, the history state or stage is set to when you open the photo. See that little icon next to the original icon of the photograph? That means that's the current history state. All right. So I don't want to go back to the original history state. Let's say I want to go back. I want to be able to go back to before I painted that little smiley face. So I'm going to make the history state right here. I just clicked in that little blank box right there. So I'm in a history state now that's before all the painting happened. And I'm now going to paint here. And it's acting like an eraser because I'm going back to that stage at this moment. And if I want to go back to, let's say, a stage where some of that stuff was still there, I can bring some of it back, but not bring all of it back. What it's allowing me to do is selectively paint in the way the photo looked at that moment in that hierarchy of histories. That's what the history brush does. So it's really the same thing as stepping backward through the history palette, except you're stepping backward by where you paint as opposed to full stages or full steps, which is why I was able to leave out little pieces here and there. But that's what it does. Now, personally, and then of course, if I go to the history state, like back up here where all the brushes were done, I can bring everything back. See, like I'm bringing back all the strokes that I created. Personally, I don't think that's as important as snapshots. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. If you're doing a lot of different things, and this also is one of those things that negates the need for hundreds and hundreds of history stages. If you're going to try a lot of different things with a photograph and be playing around a lot with a photograph, snapshots is a great way of getting back to a state where you think things were pretty good, even if you've gone on and done 500 things since then. So let's say, for whatever reason, I really like this state that I'm in with this stupid hand and this smiley face in front of it for no reason. And I want to keep this around and then experiment with a bunch of different things and be able to do anything I want to do and always be able to get back to this state. Right at the bottom of the history palette, in the place where there's usually, right in that slot, there's usually a new page icon, which means create new of whatever that palette is. And this palette happens to be a camera icon. And it says create new, what does it say? Snapshot. There it is. So I click that. And it creates, as you can see, a snapshot, which is an exact replica of what the photo was at the time that I did all this stuff. So right now, having created a snapshot for all that stuff, I can throw out a bunch of layers, right? Oops, did I miss throwing out a bunch of layers? I think I did. There we go. I can throw out a bunch of layers. I can do a whole bunch of stupid things. I'm painting in difference mode right now, right on my background. God forbid that I should ever do something like that. And as long as I'm painting, I'll throw you a little other shortcut or something. You ever want to paint a perfectly straight line? While you paint, as you start painting, hold the Shift key down. Notice it will force you to paint perfectly straight. Or, even better, hold the Shift key down and just click in different places. It'll make straight lines between all the clicks. You ever try to retouch like a telephone wire out of a photograph and you're trying to go really slow across the whole time? Just click at the beginning, Shift click at the end, and it'll clone across the entire thing. So Shift clicking will always draw you straight lines. OK, so now I've made a bunch of mess on here, and let's say another few things that you would never want to do. Fill this area with white. I just did a little shortcut. Might as well tell you that one also. If you hold the Command key and press Delete, it always fills with the background color. Option Delete always fills with the foreground color. And Shift Delete always brings up the Fill dialog box, which lets you choose any fill color you want to choose at that moment. So pretty obvious. I've done a lot of things. And let's just pretend I did 700 other things that were really stupid to this photograph. And now I don't have all the history stages left, but I always have the snapshot, because the snapshot doesn't go away. Snapshot is just basically saying, I want this history state to be preserved so I can always go back to it. So if I now want to go back to the way things were before I made all the changes, I click on the snapshot. Notice my layers come back. Everything's back to the way it was, and everything's safe. And that's really good for those of you who don't have the strong computers that can hold lots and lots of history states. Just make a snapshot every time you're at a key interval before you're experimenting on things, and you'll be able to go back to it at any time. Snapshots, by the way, do take up some memory, though, so you want to get rid of them, perhaps, if you're done with them. And I really don't need a smiley face on my photo, so I'm going to throw that out. OK, so that's the history brush and history states and how to make use of them. The next question that was raised is smart objects. How to use them, why to use them, when to use them. And we're going to take a look at this. All right, I guess we have a hand here, so we might as well use it. So I bet many of you have probably played. I mean, probably the biggest thing to play with in Photoshop is filters. I mean, as far as just experimenting, right? You just go through the filters, and the stored filters are the ones I always lean towards because they're the most sort of drastic. And I thought it would be really fun with the hand to make it do this sort of thing. So there we go. OK, so I've just distorted this. And this also will answer a question, another question that's similar. I had two questions I think that were similar. One was how and when to use smart objects. And the other one was someone was saying that they had a layer. Let's say they did a blur to it. And then they went on and did different things and tried other things and whatever. And then they come back later on, and they wanted to see exactly how much blur they did and if they could blur a little more or a little less. But they don't see any of the settings anymore. It's sort of like done. It's set in stone. And that's because of the nature of filters. And smart objects is the answer to that question. So it's sort of going to answer two questions at once. All right, so when you do a filter to a layer, it changes the pixels of that layer. If I was going to save this photograph right now, actually, I'd be OK because I made a snapshot. But let's pretend I didn't make a snapshot. If I was to save this photo right now, close it, open it up again, I would have an all gnarled hand, and I would actually have to bring it in again if I wanted it to be back to normal. That's the nature of filters. So my recommendation when you're going to use filters, make smart objects out of your layers. There's no real harm to it. It might increase the size of the file a little bit, but what the heck? You're increasing the file size a little bit just by having layers to begin with. There's many different ways to turn a layer into a smart object. One way is you can go into this is the slowest way, go into the Layers menu, choose Smart Object, convert to Smart Object. Faster than that is you can go into the Layer menu. There's a tool for it. You could right-click on the layer itself and say Convert to Smart Object. Or you could even go into the Filter menu and say Convert for Smart Filters, which converts it to a smart object also. They all do the same thing. So once you choose to make this layer a smart object, and it tells us to well, OK, thank you. All right, so once you've turned a layer into a smart object, there's a couple of things you should note. One, it has a little icon next to it. That's the smart object icon right there in the layers palette that indicates that it's a smart object. There are a few things that you can't do with it that you would have been able to do before. For example, you can take a paintbrush and now paint on this layer. Notice I get that universal cancel sort of symbol because a smart object can't be painted on. But that's okay because, as I said before, you shouldn't be painting on the same layer as the object anyway. You should be painting on a separate layer. So there's some things you can't do to that layer. There's a lot of things you can't do with adjustments. Check out the adjustments menu is pretty much gone. But that's okay too, because why are you using the adjustments menu when you have the adjustments palette and adjustment layers? It's much better. So lots of different things you can't do to a layer, most of which you probably wouldn't want to do anyway. But here's the benefit. If I go into the filter menu, go into distort, go back to that twirl command. Now when I twirl, I'll do the same amount. It remembered how much I twirled. Now when I twirl, as you can see, I have two things that come up on here. One is a little mask with the word smart filters next to it. And then beneath that, I have the twirl command. I have a little eye next to the twirl command. If I click the eye, I can hide the twirl to see what it looked like before I did the twirling at all. And this would be hours later, years later. I could save the file. It doesn't matter. And if I decide I didn't twirl the right amount, I double click the twirl command. It brings me back to the dialog box, lets me do a completely different twirl, and click OK, and never have it affect anything. So it gives you endless flexibility, and this would have been with Gaussian blur, with any filter you want to do. If you're going to do a filter and you want to have the ability to go back to that layer and control the amount of that filter, you should make it into a smart object first. That's just, I think, a rule of thumb. Beyond that, and maybe we'll learn a little bit more about this when we get to masks, but since there's also a mask, I'm going to click on the mask icon, grab hold of a paintbrush, make sure I'm painting with black. Anywhere I paint with black, on the mask. Am I on the mask? I am. OK. I'm in different. Of course. See, look at that. I'm in difference mode instead of normal mode, which is why it was doing nothing. There we go. Notice that I'm masking the twirling where I paint. So the fingertips that I'm painting over are not being twirled while the rest of the hand is twirled. The mask is to selectively untwirl or unfilter whatever pixels I want to not be affected by the filter that I just imposed on there. So that's one reason to use smart objects. The other thing I want to point out is if you change something into a smart object and you then want to change its color or its light or dark values or anything like that, as I mentioned, you can't go into image adjustments because it's not available. You wouldn't want to anyway. You'd rather go to an adjustment layer. So let's say I'm going to go to hue saturation, which of course is used to change color. I'm going to change the color of the hand, but it's not just changing the color of the hand. Notice it's changing the color of the entire photograph because, as we talked about before, adjustment layers always affect everything underneath them. But you should all know about this little button at the bottom of any adjustment. It says this adjustment affects all layers below versus clipping it to the layer beneath. If you click this little button, it will clip the adjustment layer to just the layer beneath it. So now this adjustment layer is affecting only the hand. And I'm going to click colorize because that's going to impose the color even more. And I can make this a big blue hand superimposed over the town. And there we are. OK. So that's something that we just wanted to throw that in because what the heck, we could. OK. There are other reasons to use smart objects. The other reason, and I'm going to leave this out for now. Maybe if we have time later on and anyone's interested, I can come back to it. But one of the main other reasons that you would use smart objects, or two, I'll mention two of them. One is if you're an illustrator, you use Adobe Illustrator. You always bring in things from Adobe Illustrator as a smart object. In fact, when you bring things from Illustrator, it'll ask you, do you want it to be a smart object? Or usually it just makes it a smart object automatically. And the benefit of that is that when you double click on the smart object icon, it will take you back to Adobe Illustrator and let you edit that object directly. And you have live editing, so any changes you make will be reflected in Photoshop. So that's a great thing for that. And the other reason to do smart objects is if you wanted to make duplicates. I could actually make a quick thing. So let's say, for example, I'm going to go to the hand layer. I'm going to hold the Option key and drag the hand. So I now have two different hands. Notice only one of them has the adjustment clipped to it. And what the heck, as long as we're here, I'm going to resize it. Notice, by the way, also the X when I do the transformation. That's because it's a smart object. But the point of this is that now those two layers, which are obviously different from one another in color, because one has an adjustment layer above it, one doesn't, they're tied into one another directly. And I'll show you what I mean. I decided I wasn't going to do this, but now I am doing it, so I'm going to. If you double-click the little icon that represents a smart object, it takes you into, I'm not going to bother with the little command, it takes you into a separate entity or sort of environment where that layer itself, the hand, is on a transparent background. All right, so I'm going to, let's see, what do I want to do? I'm just going to make a new layer and paint let's go to just plain old default colors. And oops, I choose the wrong tool. And make this smaller and write my initials on my hand for whatever reason. OK. So you figure that those initials are now going to be written on the one hand. Now I'm going to do save. Whenever you're in a smart object, when you actually go into a smart object, it's a separate environment. You can add as many layers as you want, do whatever you want with it. You just do Command S to save. And a lot of people are thinking, where does it save to? It's not its own separate file. It's sort of embedded within the original file. But now when I close it, watch what happens. It's written on both of them. So if you ever have a layer with some content on it, and you want to have duplicates of that layer all over the place, and then you decide later on that you need to add to that layer or enhance that layer in some way, go into the smart object, and whatever you do to that one layer will be done to all the other layers that are duplicates. That's another use for the smart object.
What about the resolution on the smart layer?
That's the biggest advantage, which I was going to get to eventually, is that, of course, of all the things, the resolution of a smart object layer is also really intact. In other words, when I resized that hand to be smaller, I didn't lose any quality. Smart objects retain the same resolution no matter what. So that's another reason to turn things to smart object, to preserve their resolution if you're going to make them much bigger, much smaller. There's lots of different things that will be preserved when you turn something to a smart object. So those are a few different alternatives. All right. I'm going to undo a bunch of those things to get back to normal. Well, I don't know if that's normal, but whatever. OK, next. There was one question. I wasn't quite sure what they meant by this, but I'm going to throw in whatever I can think of for this, is changing the background. When I think of changing the background, I think that maybe you're thinking, like maybe you've done a lot of work on a photo. Let's just pretend this was a lot of work, and I have this town in the background. And maybe I decide later on that I want a different photo in the background. So I'm going to talk about changing the background on this image. It's a really simple process, but it will introduce something. So I'm going to change it to one of these photos. Let's take this one. OK, so let's say I want that to be the new background on the photograph. All right, so I'm going to drag that layer in. We all know I could also select it and copy, paste, whatever. But I'm going to drag it into the other photo and just drop it in here. Oh, and look, it got clipped. Oh, this is a good thing that came up. I'm glad this happened. When I drag this in, the reason it's only inside the hand is because it became the topmost layer. And since the adjustment layer was the topmost layer before, it's being clipped by the hand. Remember that little arrow that we saw there? So this is being clipped by the hand also, meaning that this layer is only visible within the confines of the hand. What if I want to unclip it? To clip or unclip layers, if this ever happens to you, you go to the border between the two layers, you hold the Option key, you look for that little icon that's like a box with an arrow pointing, and you click. And you notice how that unclipped that layer, so that layer is now visible in its entirety on top of this photo. All right, so let's say I now want to make this the rearmost or background layer in this image. We all know that you can't move it to the very bottom. I'm sure some of you have tried, right? Can't do it. You can move it to the next to the bottom, but you can't move it to the complete bottom. So here's how you do it. Double-click the background layer. Anytime you double-click the background layer, a new layer dialog box comes on. And it wants to name this layer Layer 0. I'm just going to call it Silverton, because that's what the town is. OK. Whenever you double-click a new layer, or the background layer, it releases it. It means that it unlocks it. You know how the background can't be moved and you can't do anything with it? But now it's unlocked. And having unlocked this layer, I can now move it above the other one. And I can even hide it if I don't feel like seeing it. I might as well hide the adjustment too, which was associated with it. And as you can see, my new background sort of now is that layer of the sunset. That's not locked. So it's not really a background layer. But I could always just right-click on it and say new background from layer. I think, no, it doesn't even let me do that. Well, layer menu, and you go to new, and it's just called background from layer. If you wanted it to be the new background and wanted it to sort of be locked in place and whatever, I just say new background from layer, and now I've changed the background of this image to a different image. And of course, I still have the other one. So if I still want to use the other one, I would maybe another use for blending modes. maybe blend the two together and see different photos through one another and so on and so forth. Okay, so next question. This one I'm going to open up a completely different photo for. The next question was asked was, is brightness contrast really that much better in Photoshop CC that they cannot use curves and levels? I've been preaching to people to not use brightness contrast for so many years, but I can give you the definitive answer. The answer is pretty much no. It's not that much better. It's better than it was. In CS3, I think it was, they improved the brightness contrast command to not blow out things entirely. So let me go to, for example, let me take a photo that has, this is my standard that I like to use. OK. And we'll blow it up a little bit. All right. So I don't like the contrast in this photograph. It obviously needs some boost. And I'm going to go to brightness contrast, which is, of course, the first button. In the old days, when you used to increase brightness, it would just blow out everything if it wanted to. But now it's a little bit smarter. It's still blowing stuff out, but it's a little bit better about not blowing things out too badly. So let's just put it this way. It's a little better than it was, but it's never going to be as good as levels and curves. And so as long as the question was raised, I'll talk a little bit about levels and curves and why they're so much better. OK, so levels, first of all, it lets you isolate the midtones, highlights, and shadows. That's what these three sliders are for. This is me increasing the dark values in the photograph. When I take the dark slider and drag it to the right, you can see it's making the darks darker. When I take the highlights slider and drag it to the left, it's making the lights lighter. And then the midtone slider is going to make the midtones a little bit darker or a little bit lighter. But the benefit of this over brightness contrast is it allowed me to control those three different sort of shade areas as opposed to doing one thing. So I know brightness contrast is so simple, but that's not that hard, to it. And by the way, this looks much better on my screen. This is a much darker monitor. But anyway, but the point is, I'd say you shouldn't really play with brightness contrast because levels is easy enough. Curves is a little bit harder, and the one people might struggle with a little more. But let me tell you why curves is a little bit better than levels, unless you make selections. That's another thing to keep in mind. I always like to preach that. If you don't like curves, use levels and just make selections. What I mean by that is, if you want to make the statues brighter, select the statues first and then do levels to that. Then you can work on the sky and then do levels for that. If you isolate the different components in your photograph through selection, you won't need curves. But the advantage of curves over levels and way over brightness contrast is that where levels let you adjust three different shade areas, brightness, the shadows, highlights, and midtones. Curves lets you adjust up to 16 different shade areas all at once. So in curves, when you're playing with curves, let me go to the standard look for curves, which is this little curved bar right here. I've got the black slider at the far left and the white slider at the far right. They are exactly the same thing as levels. Drag the black slider to the right, makes the dark pixels darker. Drag the light pixel slider to the left, make the light pixels lighter. I'm obviously increasing contrast when I do that. When you grab hold of the curve somewhere in the middle and curve it up or down, you're adjusting the midtones. So what I've just done is exactly the same thing that I could have done with levels. But here's where curves can go beyond. And I'm going to show you what I think is the best way and easiest way to use curves. It's with this little hand thing right here. I'm going to click on this hand. And when I click on the hand, my eyedropper becomes, or my pointer becomes an eyedropper. And let's say there's a specific group of pixels that I want to adjust. Like let's say the statue, I want to make it brighter. So I'm going to go over to a very good sample pixel of where the statue's leg is, and I'm going to click on it. Notice it makes a point on my curve. And I'm going to either, I could drag up and down, or I can even hit the up and down arrows on my keyboard. By hitting the up arrow, notice I'm making that shade darker or lighter. And by going down, I'm making that shade darker. But the point of this is, whenever the curve goes more than one direction, sort of more than one big curve, you're adjusting many different shade levels. I'm adjusting 4 different shade areas right now. Now I can go over here. I see that that point is way over there. Notice it's all the way up here. Notice when I hit the down arrow now, I'm making those pixels over there a little bit bluer because I'm darkening those. So it lets you isolate different areas of the photograph or different shades of the photograph automatically. But if there are different shades, like if I was hoping to adjust these shades and there are similar shades up here somewhere, they're going to be adjusted at the same time. So what is the best way of isolating certain components or areas of the photograph and adjusting only those? As always, selection, because selection is the key to everything. So there you have it. OK, so a lot of talking for brightness contrast not really being that useful. OK, next. When and how to use the color replacement tool was the next question. And I have to admit that this one I had to look up to find out how to use the color replacement tool, because I never used the color replacement tool. And there's very good reason. There's much better ways of doing what the color replacement tool does. And it's more opportunity for me to lecture on some of the things that I think are not great about Photoshop. I mean, there's a lot of great things about Photoshop, but my take on some of the tools that they introduce, especially newer tools, like if anyone's tried those content-aware things, content-aware fills and content, and like they're great sometimes, right? And sometimes they're really horrible, you know? And the point of this is that I think as programs progress and they get bigger and they've already done so much of what they can do and they don't really have that much left to be done, they start adding more automatic things for people who are not that good at using the programs. That they're like gimmicks to me, you know? And they're not bad for if you don't know what you're doing, but they're not great if you know what you're doing and there's better alternatives. So let's go ahead and take a look at, let's open this frog picture. All right. So let's say I wanted to change the color of this frog to something else. Now, what the color replacement tool does is, I'm going to go over to the color replacement tool, by the way, is in the same slot as the brush tool. There it is. It looks like a paintbrush. It has some settings, which I'm going to talk about, but the default tolerance I know is at 30. So let's just take a look at that. OK. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment, but not too much. So I pick a foreground color of what I think is best, of what color I want the frog to become. Or, by the way, if you hold the Option key, any tool in the same slot that's a painting tool, if you hold the Option key, your tool temporarily becomes the eyedropper. And you can pick up colors directly from your photograph. So I picked up the orange from the eye of the frog here. So let's just use that color, let's say. So now I have orange as my color. So I take the color replacement tool, I click and I drag, and notice that it's turning the frog to orange. As long as I stay within the confines of the frog, I'm fine. Even go to the edge, it's still going to work OK. But if I go too far over the edge, notice how a lot of that black area is becoming orangey now as well. Well, you can't really see it. No, it's a much darker screen here. I can see it on mine, I swear. Anyway, here, I'll show it down here. If I stay here, it's not bad, but if I go over, see it now, it's going into that leaf, whatever. The point of this is, there's so many bad things about this. One, you're affecting the original background layer in a way that you shouldn't be doing. Remember I said before, if you work non-destructively and never touch the original layer, you're much better off. So that's one reason to never do this. Second reason is that there's just so many better ways of doing it. So let's take a look at the better ways. So the color replacement tool is all it really does is you pick a color, you make sure to stay within the color you're trying to replace, and it works OK. But what's a better alternative? I know you know the answer. Selections are always the better alternative, you know, in every scenario. So I'm going to show you an example of this. Well, I'm going to do this first, but then I'm going to show you an even better example. So first, let's say, you know, where color is harder to change. So first, let's say I'm going to select the frog. And you'll excuse me if my selection is not perfect, because you know, one thing I don't like to do in classes is take the time to make selections perfect. Because you know how a selection by itself can, some selections can take quite some time. So we're going to do this as accurately as we can without taking too much time. I don't care about that little thing down there. I have no idea what it is even. OK, so that's good enough. Oh, and I got his eye included there. That's going to bug me. So I'm going to deselect that little piece of eye. Oh, I've got this eye included too. I don't want that either. So notice, by the way, I'm just holding the Option key. Well, you wouldn't notice that, but I'll tell you. I'm just holding the Option key to deselect that part of the, right, here's my computer, Option key. OK. So I've got the frog selected pretty well. Let's say if I need to refine the edge, I can tell, not bad. Well, here's in a case where I'll use smooth a little bit. Look at that. Look how nice that is. All right, there we go. So I've got the selection made. So the much better way of changing the color of this frog is to just go ahead and do a hue saturation adjustment layer. So much better because it's not touching the original frog. And this way, if I decide later on, I come back into this photo and think, oh my gosh, I didn't want him to be blue, I wanted him to be green, or I wanted him to be purple, or I wanted him to be any color under the sun, I can go back in there and change the color endlessly. So much better than using the color replacement tool ever. So it's such a better alternative. So always I recommend selection. And I know a lot of people even do, and I bet a bunch of you have done this, they select the area, they make a new layer, and then fill it with a color, and then use a blending mode. That's also feasible, but it's also slower, because if you use hue saturation, you'll just be able to take the hue slider, drag it left and right, and it'll do it like that. It's so much better.
Any color? Any color you want, you can still get that.
You can still get any color, because if you go to colorize, you can actually, with colorize, you can impose any color really strongly on top of the original frog with hue saturation. You can get any color under the sun. Notice the colors are much stronger now, because when colorize is turned on, you're automatically changing every pixel to be the color that you've chosen, as opposed to just changing the current pixels. Colorize is an option right at the bottom of the properties in here in hue saturation. In fact, as long as that is good for something good to see for a bunch of you, I'll show you my other example. I've done this one in a couple of my other classes. This is a great example. Say I want to change the color of this car. So again, I'm just going to select the hood, because it's going to be fast. OK. So this is a great example. Let's say I want to change this to like a bright red sports car. So I go ahead and I click hue saturation, and I take the hue slider and I drag it, and I'm not getting bright red. I mean, the best I'm getting is this like faded pink, because the color of the car originally was a faded green. So it's staying as a faded color. Even if I saturate, saturation is intensity of color, I can get a little bit more color, but eventually if you saturate too much, you get overpixelization, and it looks terrible. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to click colorize, and I'll crank up the saturation just a little bit, and notice how much more vibrant the colors are that I'm getting now. As soon as you click colorize, anytime you ever get a very good example of this, if you've ever selected something that's close to white or close to black and tried to use hue saturation on it, nothing happens, because there's hardly any color in there. It's either too many colors, which is white, or no color, which is black. You choose colorize, it imposes that color on every single pixel in that photo, in that selection. And by the way, as long as we're talking one last thing with colorize, if I hadn't made a selection beforehand, notice, of course, when I change the colors now, every color is changing to something else. But if I click colorize, it applies that one color to the entire photo. You've all seen stuff like this where they make a photo have a cast of one color, like maybe that sepia color to make it look like it's the 20s or something, right? So it's always a nice alternative using colorize for changing colors. OK. Oh, yeah, all of this is non-destructive because I'm doing it on an adjustment layer, so the original background is still exactly as it was. Yep. All right. So that was the color replacement conversation. Yes, next thing. I'm just trying to, we got so off. Oh, and that's right, I did promise there's one other photo, because there's one other thing. As long as we're talking about replacing color, there's one other example that I think is really good to see. And it is changing color when it's across the board in a photograph. Where's the, I can't remember where I put that photo, so let's, matches color range. There it is. Color range. All right, that's it. All right. So changing the colors in these other two examples that I brought up was pretty straightforward. I had to select the car, the frog, whatever it was that I wanted to change, and I was able to use hue saturation. But I think we could all agree, if I wanted to make the green grass in this photograph a little bit more green, less green, a different color completely, it's not quite as easy a task because of the fact of how hard it would be to select all the greenery. So it's not an object that I'm really trying to address here, it's a color. I just want to take the color from this entire photo, anywhere it appears, and I want to make it different. In a case like this, where you don't have an object that's a color and surrounded by other colors, there's a command called color range that's going to help you a really large amount for this sort of thing. So I'm going to go into the color range command. And what the color range command does is it gives me a little preview in black and white of my current selection. By the way, you could also just see the image in here and see the preview on the big photo, if that's more helpful, whichever is better. But I'm going to go back to the way it was. So basically what you're doing here, anything that's white in this preview means it's selected perfectly or completely. Anything that's black is completely not selected. And anything that's gray is partially selected. And that's the key about this command. When you do selections with tools, you're either selecting or not selecting. The only time you're getting partial selection is when you feather. The edges are partially selected. But here, you're actually able to select pixels partially according to the color, because some of these pixels are green, like really green, and some of them are just a little green. And you want to select the ones that are a little green less than you select the ones that are really, really, really green. So here's how you work with color range. You take the eyedropper. It becomes an eyedropper, your pointer. You click on a pixel that would be the color you're trying to isolate. So I'm going to pick on a standard green down here. And this fuzziness slider is what will sort of let you say, I want to increase it to be more shades of green included in my selection. And notice, by the way, eventually the rocks and the water will start turning gray. That's telling me I've gone too far, like I'm including too much, because they're not really green to me at all. So I'm trying to get that good balance of where the greens seem to be white or gray, and everything that's not green is mostly black. I could also, by the way, instead of using fuzziness, I can also use the eyedropper with a plus sign to sort of isolate different shades of green. Notice as I go around to different yellowish greens, for example, I would have to then tone my fuzziness down because it's now including more pixels. Or I could take the eyedropper, bless you, with a minus to make sure, like click on the rock and click on the water and say, make sure you don't include these colors in your selection. So I get it to where I think the selection is about accurate. But no matter what, the selection is going to be tons better than using any other tool, like any selection tool, because of that partial selection nature. So that when I make the color changes, it's not going to be, looking stupid. So when I come out of color range, and also don't be alarmed by this, whenever you come out of color range, it always looks weird like this because some of the pixels are partially selected, some of them are not. And Photoshop has no way of showing partial selection, so it always just shows this sort of marching ants all over the place kind of thing. So then I go to, let's say, use saturation, just as I did before. I like to go to, let's say, fall colors. Well, that's not fall. Where's my fall colors? They're right in there, let's say. Saturate them a little bit, and there we are. And it didn't seem to capture a lot of the greens. So if I saw this, I would go back, and I could, in fact, step backward before I did color range. And in my opinion, it didn't select enough of the greens. So I go back to color range, and I just crank up the fuzziness a little bit more and do the exact same command. And we should see it affecting the pixels. Oop, a little more this time. Oh, I was changing saturation instead of color. There we go. A little bit better. But you can see it's never going to look that, the selections are not going to, well, there's still a lot of greens left out. It always goes better when I've done this before. But anyway. The point of this is, though, it's the best way of isolating colors, and that is a far better tool than the color replacement tool as well. You can do a color range command again and then play with the mask, like open up the mask. If you can fill that area with white on the mask, that would be opening up the mask. That would be another way. Or you can, of course, double-click the mask, as we've talked about before, and play with a little bit more, like accepting more pixels or increasing the area that's being affected. There's always ways you could do it. But I think, in my opinion, when you don't get color range right the first time, it's always better to go back and try it again, because you get a better feel for how much of it should be white, how much of it should be gray, to really include the number of colors that you're trying to include. OK. So let's not save that. All right, back to I can't cover every new feature in CC. I haven't really looked at every new feature in CC, to tell you the truth. But one of the features that was asked about, and again, this is one of those, I have to admit, I just played with it for the first time today, and I figure I'll show a little bit. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know a little bit about it. So there was this thing called camera shake. And I found a few photos I knew that I had that might be a good example for this. So this was, and these are my own photos. I remembered this because there was a couple of summers ago, I was sitting around at a pool party, and that's the moon, by the way, in the top right-hand corner. And that, I think, is my leg. It might be my friend's leg. I don't remember, but over on the right. But anyway, it's someone's leg. So I was taking a photo, and I was playing with, I have a nice little point-and-shoot Canon S95, which has manual controls and stuff. So I was playing around a little bit. I'm showing this one just to show you how dark it was. And these were the photos that I was playing around with to get. So, you know, these, I mean, you couldn't even see these colors at night, you know, with your regular eye. But what I was doing was I was practicing my stillness. You know, I was taking photos with 4-second exposures, 8-second exposures, and I think I even went up to 10 or 15-second, 16-second exposures to get all this stuff. And as you could see, I think you could see it here. Yeah, you could see, I think, over in here, because it's pretty obvious, they're sort of blurry, because obviously no human being can hold their hands really steady for 10 seconds and get a perfectly sharp photograph. So this new filter that was added in CC, I should say, it's in Sharpen, called Shake Reduction. And what it basically does is it analyzes your photograph. It takes a little time. Notice it's still working down here. It's telling us that it's working. And it's going to try to sharpen my photo for us. Now, it's another one of those automatic things that's sometimes going to work, sometimes not. But there are some ways to affect it. Obviously, you could play with these sliders to see, you know, the blur trace bounds is the big setting. The higher that number, the more it's going to try to sharpen things. But the more advanced thing, I think, is more useful. I don't think it works that great. I mean, you know, again, you look on Photoshop's website, they have a photo that's a perfect example. It works great. But if you go to the advanced section, there's this little show blur estimated region or estimation regions. You can actually move the area. So it analyzes, because you know, when you have a photograph, some areas are going to be blurrier than others. It's going to analyze how much it's straightening things out or how much it's fixing things based on the section that it determined. You can change that section. So in other words, I could say to Photoshop, this is the area that I think you should be focusing on. And I could even make second areas and third areas. Or I think I have to click this little, that's right, I'm just replacing the area now. And I'll have to wait for the thing. But I can just click the plus sign and make more areas. So you can basically just create your own areas and say, really look at these better, and they're better examples of where you should be sharpening things. But I play with this a lot. And for these photos, I'm just going to cancel out of this. It worked OK, but it's not going to ever be, I don't think, perfect. It's another one of these automatic things. If you shook when you took the photograph, you know, and with low light, it's really not good. With higher light, if you just shook a little bit, you might get a little bit of a better result, but I don't think there's tons.
What is it under?
It's under the filter menu under Sharpen. And by the way, it obviously would have been smart of me to have made it a smart object beforehand, so I could have gone back to my settings and played more and more, but it's under Filter Sharpen. OK. Now, these last topics, well, let's see. There were some, I mean, not last. I have about 6 or 7 of them. But these are the bigger topics. And I knew I couldn't get to everything. So I'm going to talk for another 15, 20 minutes at least, open up to some questions from you guys. And if I didn't get to your question, I apologize. Like using the pen tool is one of them, as I said, pretty high end and it's hard to get to. I'll try to get to as much as I can. But I will get to Puppet Warp because I love Puppet Warp, and I'm gonna. And that was asked, and I don't think I've ever played with Puppet Warp here in these classes, so I think it's time that we did it. So let's see. I have photos that are made for Puppet Warp or for playing with Puppet Warp. There we go. OK. All right. Here we are. OK. So, oh, thank you. OK. So here we have a little photo. I was at the Louvre, I don't know how many years ago, and I took this photo. And I just sort of like the photo. But what we're going to do is we're going to use, in fact, it'll do a little bit of content replace also, even though I don't love it. We're going to make this little kid, see how he's trying to get his mom's attention, pretty obviously. We're going to make his hand, you know, sort of move. We're going to make his hand wave around a little bit. Now, in the old days, so I've been doing retouching for many years, and in the old days, what I would have done to make this happen would be I would have selected his hand, and I would have then copied and pasted it and put it on its own layer, and I would have softened one end of it. And by the way, I might as well talk about that too. And this is an important concept, I think, for retouching, so I might as well show it. If you want to select the arm, and you wanted to, like if I just copy paste right now, we all know that that just makes a brand new layer out of my selection, but it's a really hard-edged arm on the inside. Like I want it to be soft over here, and so it blends in with the rest of the photo. So a couple things to think about when you're selecting. Many of you may know about something called Quick Mask, which is this little button right here. I'm going to go into Quick Mask mode. Quick Mask mode is a way of painting selections, where if you paint with black, you're deselecting. If you paint with white, you're selecting. But if you paint with gray, you're partially selecting. And if you paint with a soft edge brush, you're partially feathering. And that's where you can do some really interesting things in Quick Mask. So I'm going to take the paintbrush tool. I'm going to get a nice big version of a paintbrush. And I'm going to make sure it has a very soft edge. You all know about the softness of brushes, right? I'm going to make sure it has 0% hardness. And I'm going to paint right there. So notice what I've just done was I feathered one part of my selection while leaving the rest of my selection hard-edged. So now when I get back out of Quick Mask, copy paste, just to show you the arm is in fact isolated by itself, and it's got a soft edge there, so I make it blend in with other things. It's just a nice little thing to be able to do. All right, so what I'm going to do now, since I needed that arm on a separate layer no matter what, ultimately anyway, and maybe I could do more than just the arm. In fact, yeah, I'm going to do more than just the arm, because it'll be a little more fun. I'm going to select the whole kid as good as I can quickly. And let's just take away that little, that's not bad. OK, that's good enough. All right, so I'm going to copy and paste him onto his own layer, just so we can see he is now isolated on his own layer. But if I'm going to move some things around, like if I'm going to make his head twist a little bit or turn, or I'm going to make his arms move a little bit, unless I want to see multiple heads and arms, I have to get rid of the original. So I'm going to do a little bit of that too. I'm going to take a background duplicate. By the way, I'm just dragging the background layer onto the new layer icon, which makes a background copy. You could also just go into the layer menu and choose background copy or duplicate layer. That would always work. So I have a duplicate of the background. It's always safer that way. And I've hidden the version of the kid. And I'm going to now cover this kid up. So I'm going to select this area. And by the way, I should use this shortcut. This is all really important. If I've made a selection already, if you've already gone through the hassle of making a selection, some selections, as we talked about, are really difficult. You don't want to make the same selection again. I already made the selection because remember, I have that layer which has the kid on it, right? So if I want to reselect that same area, if you command click on the thumbnail that represents the layer, it recaptures that selection. Command clicking on any thumbnail always makes that become a selection. So I've reselected the kid. I'm going to go to, I'll use a couple little tricks here. I'm going to go to modify and expand. And I'm going to expand by, let's say, 10 or 15 pixels. Let's try. It's a way of making the selection a little bit bigger. It's a little bit stronger than Refine Edge, because Refine Edge could just move out or in a little bit, whereas expand or contract can do as much as I want. I'm going to soften with Refine Edge, so that I have a nice, soft, and by the way, this is a much higher res photo that I'm working with here. So I'll soften that a little bit. And then I'm going to try to use, well, we're going to see how well it works. It's not going to be great, but we're going to use content aware fill. So we go to the fill command, content aware, click OK, and deselect. That's the thing that I find that does a lot. It leaves remnants of things a lot of the time. If I would have made the selection a little bigger, maybe it might not have left as many remnants, but what the heck. Not great. I personally prefer patches and cloning, and I'm doing a very bad job of cloning right now just because I'm a little bit in a rush and I don't want to waste our time, but just going around. I'm sure all of you know how to use the clone stamp at least a little bit. That's all I'm trying to do. So we're not doing the best way of getting rid of this stuff, but getting rid of it at least decently. All right, good enough. So now we've basically, oh, it's much better on your screen. On my screen you can really see how horrible it is. OK, but we've now gotten rid of the original guy, and we have him on his own layer, but now we could do the puppet warp. So what Puppet Warp is for is basically for you to change the angles. And I like to do it with people because it's fun. And well, this is a statue of a person. But this can be done with plants, with objects, anything that's just not at the right angle. You want to straighten it out or change its angle. Puppet Warp is great for that. So I'm on the layer with the kid on it, and I'm going to go into the edit menu and choose Puppet Warp. And it creates this grid. Now, if you don't like seeing the grid, by the way, there is a little sort of mesh. They let you hide the mesh. But seeing the mesh is good. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, move over. Now, the key to using Puppet Warp always is pins and using a lot of them. There's this thing where anywhere you click now, it's going to become a pin. But you need a lot of pins. And you don't need a pin. The most common mistake that people make, notice I just made a pin at the end of the fingers there. The most common mistake people make is they think, oh, I want to move this one arm. So they make one pin right there. But if you make one pin and then you grab that pin and you start dragging it, it's not, it's the same as moving the whole thing. Now, watch what happens when I make more pins. I'm going to make a pin here at the top of the head and maybe at the end of the other arm. Still not great, because watch what happens now when I move that pin. See how it's moving some of the other parts of the body? All right. So the key to using Puppet Warp the best way you possibly can is pinning down all the key junctions. So like if I want even his arm to move at the hinge there, I'm going to pin down his elbow. I'm definitely going to pin these corners here because I don't want them to move. I'm going to pin the underarms, I think is a good area. I'm going to pin off a lot of things. It can't hurt to have a bunch of pins in there. Just as sort of junctions. And now, watch what happens when I go to that original pin. See how it's not moving anything but that one portion of the body. Also be careful, just because you're using Puppet Warp does not mean that it's going to stay in proportion. You can definitely distort this thing in ways that it should not be distorted. But I'm definitely I'm gonna take his hand and move it up here. In fact, at this point, once I got the pins showing, I think hiding the mesh is a good idea. So I'm gonna move his hand up there. A couple other little things you could do in here. If you point to a pin and hold the Option key, a little circle forms, and you can rotate around that pinpoint. So you can see, I think his hand being shaped like that would be nice. There we go. Option. So you just hold the Option and go to the outer, around the currently selected pin. It lets you sort of twist or rotate around that pin. You could also go to a pin that exists already, hold the Option key, and point directly at the pin. A little scissor comes up, and that would be a way to remove a pin, if you ever want to get rid of. Because if I remove this pin at the elbow, then it's a very different thing when I move this, because now notice his arm is going to move from the other joint, from the shoulder, instead of from the elbow. Holding the Option key.
How did you remove the pin?
Option key. The Option key is the answer to everything. The Option key directly on the pin removes it. It's all for PC. The Option key directly on a pin removes it, and the Option key around the currently selected pin lets you rotate or revolve around the pin spot. So I've now made that version. I'll click check mark, and we can undo and redo, which is really fun. And in my classes, we often, I don't like the little bend of his hand that much, but whatever. In my classes, we then go ahead and make an animated GIF out of this, which of course is definitely feasible as well. I can save both stages, both sort of history stages, and then make an animation out of it to make the kid wave back and forth. So that's Puppet Warp. But the key to Puppet Warp, again, I forgot to tilt, I was going to tilt his head. The key to Puppet Warp is making all those pins. The problem with Puppet Warp, though, is when you go back in, it does not remember all of the stuff you did. Notice I just went back into Puppet Warp, and it's back to, I'd have to start all over again. OK, so that's Puppet Warp. Always fun to do. All right, next thing. Another feature, one of the things that's great about teaching is you start learning things that you would never know because people ask you questions. So another feature that I had not played with much, I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it's something I just played with for the first time, was panoramas. Not big on panoramas. So actually, I didn't have any photos. Like, I'm not the type who takes photos that are made for panoramas. So I improvised and made a couple of photos. This is my apartment. There we go. I have lots of stuff on my walls. OK, so all I was doing, I was just sitting on the couch playing around, and I took two images. I took one. I was watching in Wimbledon. I took one image of the left side of my wall and one image which is the right side of my wall. But there's a key thing that's going on here. Notice the fireplace, I figured, would be a good focal point. You notice how you're seeing most of the fireplace here except for the far left part of it. And you notice in the other image you're seeing most of the fireplace as well except for the far right part of it. The rule of thumb that they tell you, Adobe tells you, is your photos should overlap by 40% or so. That's what they recommend, so that it can figure out where the overlap is, as opposed to it trying to do things on its own. So I'm going to close this because hopefully we won't need it anymore. All right, so the key to making a panorama, you take these photos that overlap each other by 40% or more, you go to the File menu, Automate, and then Photo Merge. This is, and by the way, if you don't know the Automate submenu, there's a lot of things in there that are automatic, like there's Contact Sheet, which could take a bunch of photos and make a contact sheet out of them. There's lens correction commands, a lot of things in here that are sort of just built-in automatic things. But I just want to point out also, if you're familiar with actions, the Automate command can be really useful because there's a command in here called batch. If you make an action, which is just recording a series of steps that you take on a photograph, if you've ever had a bunch of photos, let's say you have 100 photos that you took and they're all like the same sort of washed out, they're all that same like sort of washed out sort of bad lighting day, and you fix one of them and you feel like I would love to do this same fix to many other photos, if you make an action out of that fix and then you run a batch of a whole folder of photos, you can run that same action on a whole folder, and it's really a great solution to things. But anyway, Photo Merge. So yeah, save you many, many hours for sure. I do this with, many of you may know about like resolution. A lot of digital cameras shoot and they make the resolution 72, but the inch dimensions are like 36 by 52 or whatever, and you want to change them all to 300 pixels by whatever the other dimension would be. Make an action out of that and run a batch, and you can do it to hundreds of photos at once. All right, so the Photo Merge action is just a matter of you go into Photo Merge, it says blend images together, you say add open files, which will add, I figure that's the easiest thing. You could also browse to find the files on your hard drive, but you might as well open the files that you were going to merge and then just say add open files. You can always remove some of them if you had other ones that were open, and then you click OK. There are different methods, but I don't know. Like I said, I haven't played with it that much to really see the better thing. And I think whenever you're doing something automatic, let it figure out which the best method would be. And here's soon. And this is a fast computer. There we go. But not bad. That is my wall. I mean, it's not great around the fireplace. I noticed like right there, I can see a real sort of hinge almost. But otherwise, that's what it does. But that's all I know about this, so I'm not going to tell you anything more about it. But that's where it is, and that's my brief answer to that question. OK. What time do we have? Let's see. Oh, this one was really fun, so I'm going to show it. The question was, this was the most specific of all the questions I got. Splitting a picture into two halves, like a zipper. I don't know who that is. There you go. All right, you're gonna see it. OK, because it's a fun thing to do. So let's see. We'll open up. Really, it could be any photo that we do this with. So let's just take. Well, let's make that the background, and then we'll take another photo. Might as well start with this that we started with, and we're gonna move it in. All right. So there's lots of different ways of doing this, and I'm going to resize this just to make them the same basic size. That's good enough. All right. So my premise is going to be that the photo underneath, I think this is the most efficient way to start. The photo underneath is the one that I want to see through the zipper. And the photo on top is the one that I want to make become zipper-like. OK, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rectangular selection tool. I'm going to select one half of the photograph. And I'm going to go into the warp command. So I go to, not perspective warp, but just go to transform and then warp. And there's a few little tips that I have on this that I think are important. First of all, in fact, I might even go through the tips on a block of text. When you go into warp, be aware of the fact that there are several different warping types. A lot of people just think that this is the only thing you can do, and this is custom warp. And in this example, this is what you need. However, there are a lot of different built-in warps that are really cool for things that you might want to use. So for example, this one, arch and bulge, these can be really useful. I've shown these. I've done examples with my classes where we take an image and we make it look like it's on a coffee cup, sort of like bend it to the coffee cup. And even though the first one, which was called custom, I could probably do it by eye, these other ones often are really perfect for what you need to do, like this arch thing, and then you can go ahead and determine how much of a bend there is. So it really might be that one of the presets is a better alternative than custom doing it. But I'm going to go back to where I started because I do in this case want to do the custom warping. So all you got to do to make the flap, I'm going to take the top pixel or top resize box, and I'm going to drag downward because as you can see, it makes that flap that you needed, sort of. I have to play a little bit with these handles. If you know anything about points and handles, the handles are just going to let me control the curves that come off of that one point. So I pull it down the amount that I think is appropriate, and I'm going to hit Enter to leave that as it is. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the other part, other half of the photograph, other half of that layer, I should say. Do the same exact thing, and pretty obvious I'm just taking the other pixel. But in my mind, I don't think there's any way that I can sort of say do the exact same thing. I think I have to sort of eyeball it here. Now, one thing that I thought of that would make this even more realistic is I'm going to select, and I'm not going to take a lot of time to do this, but I just want to talk about it a little bit. There, that's not terrible. Trying to select that little piece that would be the flap, sort of. And if I copy paste it onto its own layer, I think there's benefit to that because then I can double click, which of course brings me into effects, drop shadow, and move the, you could see how bad my selection was. And by the way, size in a drop shadow is softness. If my selection was good there, I can get a really nice, like it looks like a flap because it has a drop shadow behind it. So I'll leave that as it is, even though I'm appalled by how bad my selection came out. But you get the gist, hopefully. But I had to put it on its own layer so that I was putting a drop shadow on only that one little flap and not the whole thing. And I also like to point out when you click drop shadow, you can actually move it by hand. A lot of people don't know that you can move drop shadows manually like that. So, all right. So I would pick the two drop shadows, and I think that's about it. If I took it, brought in a picture of a zipper, I think I'd be pretty much done. Yeah, there we go. OK. So really, thank you for that question, because it was just fun to do. Let's see. You also had the question about the perspective warp. I have no idea why it wasn't available on your computer. That one I really don't know. So the only things I have left, really, are reviewing basic masking, hair and fur selection, which is a gigantic topic, which I don't know that I'll have time for, and using the pen tool, which is also a gigantic topic. But let's go over a review of basic masking, I think, is something that, of course, I can do. And then we'll see what we have time for, and we'll see what kind of questions you guys have. All right, so basic masking. Oh, yeah, you know what? Let's use Silverton, Colorado. We're on Silverton, Colorado kick. We might as well just use it. OK. So let's just say that I wanted to put something behind the mountains. This is something I've done. I don't know if you guys have been in my classes before. I've actually got a picture like this. So I'm going to go ahead and find something. So first of all, I've got to go to my sample photos and find something. And I have a few things that are already silhouetted. So why not put a big soda bottle for no reason behind there? Oh, the Statue of Liberty. That'll be much more fun. OK, there we go. All right. And this also gives me the opportunity. This is a great example. In fact, I use this photo because this is a great example of a photo, first of all, where the selection is better when you select the opposite of what you want rather than the thing you want. In other words, the blue of the sky is going to be much easier for me to select than to try to select the statue. And another example I like about this is that when I use the quick selection tool, it works OK, but notice how it cuts into selecting parts of her that it thinks are similar to the blue. This is one of those rare cases where the quick selection tool is so great usually, but this is one of those rare cases where the magic wand actually works better. I'm just going to shift click to add little blue pieces and look at how much more it isolates the statue herself. So I selected everything but the statue, and I go into the select menu and choose inverse, which means I've got the statue herself selected. And then I'm going to take the statue, and this is a much higher res photo, so it's going to be gigantic. And we'll resize her down. There we go. I feel there is a remake of Planet of the Apes coming up soon, I think. I saw a commercial for that, so it's perfect timing. OK, So there we have. And we have to slant it a little bit, you know. Okay. Okay, so there we have Miss Liberty there, and we're going to put her now behind the mountain. So the whole purpose of masking, there's so many different reasons to use it. I know some of you may have been here when I've done a masking class. I'm sure we'll do it again in upcoming months, so I'll see you back here for that perhaps. But a lot of different things I could do with masking. One reason to use a mask is to replace things in a photo. Another is to make things look like it's up hidden behind other things. But the big thing I like to talk about when I use masks is mostly what I'm doing is I'm using a mask as a way of hiding parts of my layer without eliminating parts of my layer. In other words, we all know that I could take an eraser tool right now, God forbid, and erase like half of her body and make her sort of look like she's behind these mountains, except if I don't paint really well, or I would make it so that she only looks like she's behind this one portion. I want to move her. It's no good. Never think to erase things. The only time I ever use an eraser or I delete pixels is when it's pixels I know I do not need. There's no reason to erase, though, pixels that I know might come back, I might need later on. So I'm going to use a mask instead. So I want to make it so that the Statue of Liberty, is only viewed behind the mountains, as if she's behind the range of mountains. So we know how easy the sky was to select beforehand. I went back to the background. I'm hiding the Statue of Liberty for the moment just because it's easier to see the rest of the photograph. I'm going to go ahead and select the sky. You all remember how easy that was. We started out this way. And now that I've got that selection made, that's exactly the area that I want to become the mask. So I go back to my Statue of Liberty layer. Remember, selections are not, they can be made on one layer, but they don't have to be used on the same layer. So I made the selection on the background, but now I'm going to use that selection on the layer that has Miss Liberty on it. And I just click on this little icon down at the bottom of the layers palette that says Add Layer Mask. It makes the current selection a layer mask. Now, it looks like she's behind the mountain, but if I move her, it's going to mess things up, and it's only because I didn't have it at the right state. You always have to make sure when you've made a mask, there's a link in between the mask and the layer icon. If that link is turned on, that means that the mask and the layer will travel together. In this case, I don't want that because the mask is something that's fixed on this photo. It's the area that represents the sky. So I want to unlink the two, make sure that the layer is active, not the mask, meaning the Statue of Liberty. And now, as you can see, I'm able to move her around and make her visible anywhere I want her to be. Now, let's say I change my mind. Let's say I realize that I like this, but I wanted her to be behind the town, not behind the mountains, right? So I want to make her a little closer to the town. So now I'm going to go back to the background layer, and I'm going to select the area of the mountains. And this selection, of course, is not quite as easy, so you'll excuse me for, again, I'm not going to make it perfect, but I'm going to try to make it a little better than it was. I'm just trying to get all these store tops sort of selected. I'm going to leave out that little chimney up there. But there, that's almost good enough. It's never good enough, but whatever. OK, so now there's extra area I want to add to the mask. So not only can you can make a mask by selecting, which is what I did before, but since I've already made the mask, I can't say click the mask button again. Actually, it will make a second mask, and most people don't know what that is. It's actually what's called a vector mask, which is going to do nothing, essentially. So the question is, how do I open up the mask to make it more visible, either make her more visible in the areas I've just selected? And the answer is changing the black and white values on a mask. First of all, a couple of shortcuts. Option clicking a mask shows you the actual mask. And option click again, it comes back. Shift clicking a mask shows you what the layer is without the mask. Shows you that I still have the entire content of the layer active. It just deactivates the mask temporarily. So what I basically need to do, let's show that black and white version again. I need all these areas that are black, which represented the mountains, to now be white. Because white on a mask means visible. Black on a mask means don't show those pixels. So how am I going to do that? Very simply, I'm going to fill this whole area with white. So I'm going to go, and I have a shortcut for that. Remember I said earlier, the background color is currently white. Command delete fills with the background color. I make sure I'm on the mask, and I command delete, and I can deselect. And now, as you can see, and just to show you what the mask looks like now, see how it's just whiter in more areas? And now, of course, I go back to the layer with the statue on it, and she can move around as if she's behind all the different stores. And if I want to make her look like she's like, let's say, if I now want to make it look like her arm is going into the clouds a little bit, another last alternative I'll talk about with this, and then I'll open up for questions. If I paint with a brush, if I paint with, let's say, on the mask, let's go back to the mask. If I paint with black, I'm hiding. I paint with white, I'm showing. But how about if I paint with a shade of gray? I'm going to paint with, let's say, 50% gray. So it's partially going to mask. So it's making it look like part of her arm. And then I can make the percentage of gray a little darker and make it, let's say, a little bit of a smaller brush and make this one little section right there look like it's behind the clouds. So I can selectively choose as much or as little of the clouds covering her arm as I feel like. So it makes it look like her arm is sort of going into the clouds. So it's just showing you that you can use a combination of selections and painting on masks to determine what's visible. But again, bottom line, when I deactivate the mask, you notice I didn't erase 1 pixel. So I've never damaged the original layer. So therefore, I have endless possibilities. And just to show you what this mask looks like, see just some dabs of gray up there. There we are. All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.